Imagine.
Hello everyone, I am Dark Imagine, Master of Stories, and I am here to help today. I know you need to this video for a sleep. Before that, like the video and subscribe to Dark Imagine. Also, where you from and what time are you watching now. Get comfortable, relax. Let's start with third story, The Forgotten Child. In the small windswept town of Ridgebrook, nestled between dense forests and hills that stretched into the horizon, there stood a house, an old weathered structure that had seen better days. It had once been a grand home, a symbol of wealth and prominence. But now it was a shadow of its former self. The paint had peeled away, the windows were cracked, and the garden, which was once lush with flowers, was overgrown with weeds. It was the kind of house that stood out in a town where every building seemed to carry the weight of time. But this one, in particular, was different. People avoided it, steering clear as they walked past. Children dared not even approach it, for there were rumors about what had happened there, whispers of a tragedy that had left a deep scar on the town's history for years. The house had been abandoned. No one lived there, and the town had slowly forgotten about it. That is, until Eleanor Caldwell returned. Eleanor had been away for many years, and when she finally decided to come back to Ridgebrook, she felt a strange pull to the old house. Her parents had lived there once, many years ago, and she had grown up in its rooms. She remembered the sounds of her mother's laughter echoing through the hallways, the smell of her father's pipe smoke curling in the air, and the warmth of the family gathered around the fireplace. But that was before the fire, before everything had changed. The fire had consumed the house one fateful night, taking with it Eleanor's parents. She had been just a child at the time, and her memories of the night were clouded by fear and confusion. She had been outside, playing in the yard, when the flames had erupted from the windows, engulfing the house in a fiery embrace. She remembered the sound of her mother screaming, but it was distant, as if it had come from someone else's life. She had been pulled away by the neighbors, and the next thing she knew, she was in the care of distant relatives, her world forever altered. The fire had left a void in Eleanor's heart, a space filled with unanswered questions and unspoken grief. She had never been able to reconcile the loss of her parents, and though the years had passed, the pain had never truly left her. When she received the call that the house was hers, left to her by a distant relative who had passed away, she felt a strange sense of duty to return, to reclaim the place that had once been her home. It was a rainy evening when Eleanor first returned to Ridgebrook, the kind of night that made the town look even more desolate than it already was. The streets were empty, and the mist from the hills clung to the ground, wrapping the town in a cold embrace. The drive to the house was long and winding, the road barely visible through the fog. The closer she got to the house, the more uneasy she felt, as if the very air was thick with something she couldn't name. But she pressed on, determined to see the house once more, to face the memories that had haunted her for so long. When she finally arrived, she stood in front of the old house, her heart heavy with emotions she couldn't quite place. The house loomed before her, dark and foreboding, its windows like empty eyes staring into the night. It was hard to believe that this had once been a home, a place where laughter and love had filled the rooms. Now it felt like a tomb, a mausoleum for memories best forgotten. Eleanor stood at the doorstep, her hand hovering over the old brass knocker. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready to open the door and step into the past. But something inside urged her to do it. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly in protest, as if the house itself was reluctant to allow her in. She stepped inside, and immediately the air felt different. The temperature dropped, and the silence was oppressive. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. The grand foyer was just as she remembered it, though it had clearly seen better days. The chandelier that once hung in the center of the room was now shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor like broken promises. The stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed to the second floor where the bedrooms were located. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Each door she passed seemed to whisper a memory, each one more painful than the last. But there was one door at the end of the hall that caught her attention. It was the door to her old room, the room she had shared with her younger brother Thomas. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, she was immediately hit with a wave of nostalgia. The room was just as it had been before the fire, though much of the furniture had been damaged. It still held the faint remnants of their childhood. Her old bed, the one with the faded floral quilt, sat against the wall. The toys they had played with together were scattered across the floor, their once bright colors dulled by time. But there was something else, something more disturbing. On the wall opposite the bed, there was a portrait of Thomas, painted in oils. It had always been there, a gift from their mother who had loved to paint. But now the portrait was different. The image of Thomas had changed, his face no longer smiling, his eyes dark and hollow, as if someone had taken him from the painting. Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine, a sensation she couldn't explain. She reached out to touch the portrait, but her hand froze inches from the canvas. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The house seemed to come alive in the darkness, creaking and groaning as if it were trying to communicate with her. The wind howled outside, and the rain battered against the windows, but it was the silence within the walls that unnerved her most. She lay awake, her mind racing with thoughts of of her brother, of the fire that had torn everything apart. She closed her eyes, trying to push the memories away, but they came flooding back, as vivid as if they happened yesterday. The next morning, Eleanor decided to explore the town, to reconnect with the place that had once been her home. She walked through the streets, past the small shops and old buildings, until she reached the cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was here that her parents were buried, their graves marked by simple headstones. She knelt in front of them, her heart heavy with grief. She hadn't been able to mourn them properly, not when she was just a child, and even now, as an adult, the pain was still fresh. As she stood to leave, a figure caught her eye. It was a child, standing just beyond the cemetery gates, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. The child was small, dressed in tattered clothes, and appeared to be no older than 5 or 6. But there was something strange about the child, something that made the hairs on the back of Eleanor's neck stand on end. The child smiled at her, an unsettling grin that sent a shiver down her spine. "Thomas!" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling, but the child didn't answer. Instead, they turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the thick fog that clung to the ground. Eleanor's heart raced. She had seen her brother's face, hadn't she? She had seen him before the fire, and now she was sure it was him. But how could it be? Thomas had died in the fire. There was no way he could be standing there in front of her. She rushed after the child, calling out his name, but when she reached the spot where he had been standing, there was no trace of him. The fog had swallowed him whole, leaving nothing behind but the sound of her own breath, quick and ragged in the stillness. She felt a sense of dread wash over her, an overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next few days were a blur of confusion and unease. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the house was hiding something from her. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the wind, seemed to carry a message she couldn't quite understand. And then, one night, as she sat in the living room, she heard the soft sound of a child's laughter coming from upstairs. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It was unmistakable. It was the sound of her brother's laugh, the one she had heard 1,000 times before. She rushed upstairs, her feet barely touching the steps as she ascended. She reached the hallway, her breath shallow and erratic, and followed the sound to her old room. But when she opened the door, there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But on the floor near the bed was something she hadn't noticed before. It was a small, worn teddy bear, its fur frayed and its eyes missing. It was the same bear Thomas had carried everywhere as a child, the one he had refused to let go of after their parents' death. Eleanor picked it up, her hands trembling as she turned it over. And then she saw a small, faded note pinned to the back of the bear. She pulled it free, her fingers shaking as she read the words scrawled in childish handwriting. "Help me, Eleanor. I'm still here." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The note was from Thomas, or at least it felt like it was. It was written in his handwriting, the same childish scrawl she remembered from their childhood. But how could this be? How could Thomas still be here in the house after all these years? She turned to look at the portrait of him on the wall, the one that had been altered, the one that now depicted him as a hollow-eyed figure. The image seemed to stare back at her, accusing her, as if the house itself were trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to understand. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by the fireplace, the teddy bear in her lap, and waited. She waited for the truth to reveal itself, for the answers to the questions that had plagued her for so long. And as the hours passed, the house seemed to grow colder, its silence more oppressive, until finally she heard the sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. She stood up, the bear still in her hands, and walked toward the door. The footsteps stopped just outside, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then the door slowly creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was Thomas, or at least it looked like him. But his eyes were empty, hollow, dark, the same eyes she had seen in the portrait. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, staring at her with that same unnerving smile, as if he had never left, as if he had been waiting for her all along. Some stories are best left untold, until they find you. And when they do, there is no escape. The second story is The Unfinished Letter. Claire sat in the dusty attic of her late grandmother's home, a small creaky house on the outskirts of town that was as much a relic of the past as it was a home. The wooden beams above her head groaned with the weight of time, and a thin stream of sunlight filtered through the narrow window, casting a faint glow on the forgotten piles of old furniture and mementos that cluttered the space. She wiped her brow, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of a cardboard box that had been stored away for years, untouched by the world below. The label on the box was faded, but she could just make out the name written in her grandmother's handwriting, Claire's Things. A shiver ran through her as she wondered why her grandmother had kept it, packed away and hidden in the attic as if some part of Claire's life was still locked within. As she opened the box, an overwhelming smell of old paper and dust hit her, and Claire's heart skipped a beat when she saw what lay inside. Old photographs, tattered journals and letters, their edges yellowed with age, were scattered haphazardly. Among the items, Claire's eyes fell on a letter, a single sheet of paper folded neatly in half. There was no envelope, just the letter itself, its edges frayed as though it had been handled often, and the writing on the paper was unmistakable. It was her grandmother's handwriting, but what caught her attention the most was the date. It was from many years ago, from a time when Claire had been just a little girl, long before her grandmother passed away. The words on the letter felt strangely familiar, yet the weight of their meaning hung heavily in the air. Claire took a deep breath, hesitating for a moment, before slowly unfolding the fragile paper. She was already aware that her grandmother had kept many secrets, things that Claire never fully understood. Growing up, her grandmother had been a quiet, reserved woman, always keeping to herself, never speaking much about her past, but Claire had never questioned it. Until now. The letter began with a name Claire didn't recognize. Her grandmother had written to someone named Thomas. Her grandmother's words were tender, but there was a clear undercurrent of sadness running through them, something Claire had never heard in her grandmother's voice. The letter spoke of love, of longing, and of the desire to return to a life that could never be again. As Claire read, she could almost feel the weight of the words, the desperation that clung to them. But then, as her eyes scanned further, Claire realized that the letter abruptly stopped. There were no more words. just an unfinished sentence, cut off in mid-thought. Uh, she read the last few lines again, her heart hammering in her chest. I'll never forget the first time I saw you. You were standing by the... That was where it ended. No more words, just a blank space where the rest of the sentence should have been. Claire's hands trembled as she held the paper, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make sense. Why would her grandmother leave the letter unfinished? And why had Claire never seen it before? She had been close to her grandmother, always at her side when she could be, but this letter spoke of a different time, a different woman. Claire's mind raced. Who was Thomas? And why did her grandmother write to him, yet never finish what she had started to say? More questions swirled in her mind, but there was one thing she was sure of. The letter was not just some forgotten relic. It had meaning. And she needed to know what it was. She carefully folded the letter back and placed it gently on the floor beside her. There was a strange pull inside her, an urge to find answers, and she couldn't ignore it. The old house felt oppressive, the silence thick around her, and Claire couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't alone in that attic. But there was no time to entertain irrational fears. Her grandmother's secrets had always been a part of the home, but now it seemed as though they were calling to her, beckoning her to uncover them. She climbed down the attic stairs and made her way to the old wooden desk in the study, a place where her grandmother had spent many hours writing, reading, and thinking. The desk, with its dark, polished wood and heavy drawers, seemed to loom over the room as though it held more than just papers and books. As Claire opened the top drawer, her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to find anything else, but there, at the bottom of the drawer, was another envelope. It was addressed to her grandmother, but the name on the envelope was familiar. It was Thomas. Her hands felt numb as she slowly pulled the envelope from the drawer. The handwriting on the front of the envelope was the same as the one in the letter she had just read. Claire felt a lump form in her throat. She could no longer deny it. There was something about Thomas that was more than a mere name from the past. He was a part of her grandmother's life, a part of the history she had never been told. With trembling hands, Claire tore open the envelope. Inside, there was another letter, this one far older than the one she had read in the attic. As she unfolded the brittle paper, she saw that the words were written in a different hand, a man's handwriting. This letter, unlike the one her grandmother had written, was a confession. The man, Thomas, spoke of his undying love for her grandmother and of a secret that neither of them could ever share with the world. He spoke of a love so intense that it had driven him to the edge of madness, a love that had led to the end of their time together. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she read his words. Thomas spoke of a promise, a pact made long ago between them that had sealed their fates forever. He'd promised her grandmother that he would wait for her, that he would never truly leave her. But there was more. He wrote of a tragedy, something dark and terrible that had kept them apart. Claire's mind reeled as she tried to piece together the fragments of the past, but the letter was incomplete. It too had been cut off in mid-sentence. The sensation of being watched returned, more intense than before. The house seemed to be alive with a presence that she couldn't ignore, and she felt her pulse quicken as she glanced nervously over her shoulder. It was ridiculous, she thought. She was alone, but the weight of the past seemed to press in on her, and she could almost hear the faint whispers of voices speaking in tones that were not her own. She couldn't almost hear the faint whispers of voices speaking in tones that were not her own. But before she could gather herself, A soft knock echoed through the house, breaking the oppressive silence. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? She hadn't seen anyone all day. Cautiously, Claire set the letters down on the desk and made her way to the front door. When she opened it, she was greeted by nothing but the empty porch. Yet, there, on the doorstep, was a small, unmarked package. Claire stared at it for a long moment. The weight of it felt significant, though there was nothing outwardly remarkable about it. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, and there was no return address, just a single word written on the top. Claire. Claire. Her stomach churned as she bent down and picked up the package. As her fingers brushed against the rough paper, a chill ran through her. Something about it felt wrong, as though it had appeared out of nowhere, appearing at the exact moment she had uncovered the letters. With a sense of unease rising in her chest, Claire brought the package inside, placing it on the kitchen table. She untied the twine, peeled back the paper, and found another envelope inside. This one, unlike the others, was sealed with a dark wax stamp. The emblem on the seal looked familiar. She had seen it before in the old photographs tucked away in her grandmother's photo album. But the name engraved in the wax was not one she had ever encountered. Thomas Blackwood. Her heart raced. It seemed impossible. Yet there it was, the final piece to the puzzle. The name that had haunted her grandmother's life was now standing before her. Claire hesitated for a long time, but finally she broke the seal, her hands trembling as she unfolded the letter inside. And as the words began to spill out, Claire realized that her grandmother's past had come back to claim her, and with it, an unspoken promise that Claire was now bound to fulfill. This is the beginning of the episode's expanded story, introducing the atmosphere of suspense, mystery, and building dread. If you'd like me to continue or expand upon any section in more detail, please feel free to let me know. Third story is the empty chair. Margaret stood in the doorway of the dining room, her heart heavy with an emotion she couldn't name. The house was eerily quiet, except for the creaking sound of the old floorboards beneath her feet. It was a silence that seemed to weigh on the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Her eyes drifted to the table in the center of the room, where her grandmother's polished oak dining set had once gleamed full of life, family. But today it was just a room empty, cold, and silent. And there it was, the chair. At the head of the table, untouched, unmoving, sat the empty chair. Margaret's eyes locked on it. It had always been there, a fixture of family dinners for as long as she could remember. But now, as the years had gone by, the chair had become more than just a piece of furniture. It had become a symbol of something that Margaret couldn't quite grasp. The chair that once held her grandfather. The chair that, for some reason, never seemed to be quite as empty as the others. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts that clouded her mind. It was silly. She had been back in this house for a week, sorting through her grandmother's things, trying to find some semblance of closure after the old woman's passing. But every time Margaret stepped into the dining room, the chair seemed to stand out in a way it never had before. It had always been there, yes, but now it felt different. Not just empty, but waiting. Margaret closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silence. She walked toward the table, her footsteps muffled against the worn carpet that covered the wooden floors. As she approached the chair, she could almost feel a presence, something that made the air around her heavier, thicker, as though something was waiting to be said. She reached out a trembling hand and ran it along the back of the chair. It was cold, like the rest of the house, as if it had been forgotten for years. But Margaret knew better. Her grandmother had never truly abandoned anything. Everything in this house had its place, its purpose. Her grandmother had always been meticulous, always had a reason for everything she did. But Margaret couldn't ignore the feeling that had been creeping up on her since she arrived, an unsettling sense that something had been left undone. She had gone through the house, sorting through old books, papers, and knickknacks. but it was the chair that had drawn her in, that had left her with a gnawing feeling that something was missing, as if she were waiting for someone to come and sit there, as if someone had been sitting there but had never left. She shook her head again, forcing herself to focus. She had come here to pack up the house, to clear out the remnants of a life that had come to an end. But every room she entered, every drawer she opened, felt like she was walking deeper into a past that refused to be forgotten. The photographs on the walls seemed to stare at her with eyes that were too knowing, too wise for their time. The faint smell of her grandmother's perfume lingered in the air, mixing with the dust of years gone by. It was as if the house itself held onto its memories, refusing to let them go. Margaret had been living in the city for years, far from the quiet small town where she had grown up. But after her grandmother passed away, Margaret had returned to take care of the house, to see to her affairs. It should have been simple. There were no other family members to speak of, no cousins or distant relatives to contest the will. But as Margaret had spent more time in the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house, once warm and inviting, now felt like a mausoleum, each room echoing with the ghosts of the past. She turned away from the chair and walked to the window, her eyes drawn to the overgrown garden outside. It was late afternoon, and the light slanted through the glass, casting long shadows across the floor. The house had always been full of life, family gatherings, holiday meals, the sound of laughter filling every room. But now, it was empty. Even the garden, once carefully tended to by her grandmother, was a neglected tangle of weeds and vines. The once pristine lawn had grown wild, as if nature itself had turned its back on the place. Margaret felt a pang in her chest as she thought of her grandfather. He had passed away when Margaret was just a child, but she still remembered him. He had been a tall man with a deep voice and a quick laugh. He had always sat in that chair at the head of the table, and Margaret had always thought of it as his seat, the place where he belonged. It was where he had sat for family dinners, where he had held court, telling stories, giving advice. But after he passed, the chair had remained. Her grandmother, who had always been so practical, had never gotten rid of it. It had simply stayed, as if it were waiting for him to return. Margaret's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she looked, there was no one there. The room was still. The house was still. Margaret let out a shaky breath and laughed nervously. She was starting to imagine things. She hadn't been sleeping well, and the isolation was beginning to take its toll. She had been alone in this house for days with nothing but the memories of her childhood to keep her company, but still, the chair seemed to call to her, to demand her attention. That night, after she had eaten a lonely dinner in the kitchen, Margaret sat on the couch in the living room, staring at the family portraits that lined the walls. Her grandmother, young and vibrant, smiling alongside her grandfather. Their wedding photo framed in gold, their faces full of hope and promise. And then there was the photo of her grandfather, sitting proudly in that same chair, his arm around her grandmother, both of them smiling at the camera. It was as if the past was closing in on her. The images seemed to speak to her, to beckon her back to a time when the house had been full of life. Margaret found herself thinking about her grandmother's last days, wondering if there had been something more she could have done. Her grandmother had never spoken much about her husband's death, but Margaret knew it had affected her deeply. After he passed, her grandmother had become a shell of the woman she had once been, retreating into herself, never quite the same. Margaret had always felt a sense of distance from her grandmother, despite the fact that they had spent many years living together. There had always been something guarded about her, something she had never fully shared. And now, with the house empty and her grandmother gone, Margaret found herself questioning everything. What had happened to her grandmother after her grandfather's death? What had driven her to remain so quiet, so withdrawn? She stood up abruptly, feeling restless, as if the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't stay in the living room any longer. She had to do something. She walked toward the dining room again, drawn by the same pull, the same quiet urgency that had been with her all day. The chair still sat there waiting. This time, when Margaret walked into the room, she couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just an empty chair anymore. It was a symbol. a sign of something left undone, something unresolved. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at it, her mind racing. She walked to the chair, feeling the familiar coldness of the wood under her fingertips. But as she touched it, a strange sensation washed over her, shiver that ran down her spine. Suddenly, the chair felt different. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was as if it were alive, as if it had a presence, a weight that wasn't there before. Margaret took a step back, her heart racing in her chest. She stared at the chair, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She wasn't sure what she was feeling, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone in this room anymore, Doc. And then, as if in answer to her unspoken thoughts, the door behind her creaked open. This is the beginning of the expanded episode. If you'd like, I can continue to develop the rest of the story, building toward the emotional climax and eerie resolution. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. The fourth story is The Whispering Walls. Emma and Jack had been searching for a new place to settle for months. They had grown tired of the city, the constant noise, the ever-present hum of life just a little too loud. They needed somewhere quieter, somewhere peaceful, somewhere that could give them a sense of escape, a fresh start. They found it in the old house on the edge of town. It wasn't much to look at first. The house stood alone on a stretch of land surrounded by thick trees, with overgrown ivy creeping up its crumbling facade. The wood was weathered, the paint peeling in spots, but there was something about it, something that called to them. The moment Emma stepped through the front door, she felt as though she was stepping into another world. There was a stillness to the house, a calm that seemed to wrap itself around her like a blanket. When Jack walked in behind her, he too felt it. He could see it in Emma's eyes, the way she seemed at home already, as though the house had been waiting for them. It was as if the building itself was alive, ready to welcome them with open arms. But that feeling, that initial sense of comfort, would soon begin to fade. The house had a history, one that the realtor had been careful not to mention. It was an old farmhouse built in the late 1800s by a family that had lived in the area for generations. They had prospered for many years, their land abundant with crops and livestock. But as time passed, the family began to dwindle. Tragedy struck in the form of illness, a series of accidents, and one by one, the family members disappeared. It was rumored that the house had been left abandoned for nearly a decade before it was sold to the current owners, a couple who had stayed long before moving out just as quickly as they had come in. The house's reputation wasn't the most stellar. The whispers about its dark past circulated in hushed tones among the townspeople. Stories of strange happenings, voices in the night, and footsteps echoing through the halls when no one was there. Of course, those were just rumors. People loved to embellish stories, but Emma and Jack didn't care. They weren't interested in what the townsfolk said. They had their own dreams, their own vision for this place. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. The creaking of the old house felt like character, the gentle groans of the wood settling into place. The floorboards, worn smooth by years of use, seemed to hum beneath their feet. The house felt alive, but in a comforting way. The couple had settled in quickly, unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, and making the place their own. It was peaceful, serene, or so they thought. It started small, almost imperceptible at first, a sound in the middle of the night, a soft rustling. At first Emma chalked it up to the wind, the old house shifting in the dark. But then it happened again, and again. At first Jack didn't hear it. He thought it was her imagination running wild, the house settling, the pipes groaning. But Emma knew what she heard. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house. It was a whisper, faint, soft, but unmistakable. Emma had always been sensitive to these kinds of things. Growing up, she'd often felt an awareness, a heightened sense of something beyond what was visible. She dismissed it as her mind playing tricks on her, an overactive imagination. But then, the whispers began to come more frequently. At night, as she lay in bed, the sounds seemed to surround her. They were so faint, so distant, that she couldn't make out any words, but she could feel them. They were in the walls, in the corners, in the spaces between the rooms. They were there, just out of reach, like a language she couldn't quite grasp. One evening, after a long day of unpacking and settling into their new home, Emma found herself sitting in the living room, staring at the old stone fireplace. The house was quiet, too quiet. Jack had gone out to run some errands, and Emma had decided to stay behind and sort through some old boxes. She was running her fingers across the old wood paneling when she heard it again, a soft whisper, barely a breath against the stillness. Emma froze. This time it was different. The whisper seemed to be directed at her, not just a random sound floating in the air. It was a voice, faint but distinct. She leaned closer to the wall, her heart racing. The whisper was clearer now, though she couldn't understand the words. They were jumbled, like someone speaking through a veil, but there was something else, an urgency. She could feel it. The whisper seemed to pulse through her, a rhythmic, steady beat that filled her chest with an inexplicable dread. She stood up quickly, heart pounding in her throat, and backed away from the wall. It was as if the house itself was speaking to her, beckoning her, warning her. She turned toward the door just as Jack walked back in, his face breaking into a smile when he saw her. But when he saw the look on her face, his smile faded. Emma, what's wrong? Jack asked, setting down the groceries. Emma tried to shake off the fear that was gripping her. It's nothing. It's just I thought I heard something, she said, her voice trembling. Like what? Jack asked, his brow furrowing in concern. I don't know. It's hard to explain. It's just a whisper. Coming from the walls, she said, feeling ridiculous as the words left her mouth. Jack looked at her, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. A whisper from the walls, he repeated, walking toward her. Emma, are you sure? Maybe it's just the house settling. It's old. It's bound to make strange noises. I know what I heard, Jack, Emma replied, her voice growing stronger. I've been hearing it for days. It's not the house. It's something else. Jack stepped closer to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Hey, it's okay. You're just tired, that's all. Let's sit down, take a breath. We'll figure it out. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt different now. It felt like it was hiding something, like it was holding its breath, waiting for her to uncover its secrets. She had no idea what was behind the whispers, but she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. That night they went to bed early, both exhausted from the day's work. But as soon as they lay down, the whispering returned. It was faint at first, like a soft hum just beyond the reach of hearing. Emma tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as though the walls themselves were vibrating with the voices. She sat up in bed, her pulse quickening. The sound seemed to come from the walls, from every corner of the room. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a voice. A voice that she recognized. It was her grandmother's voice. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Her grandmother had passed away years ago, but the voice she heard in the walls was unmistakable. It was the voice she had grown up with, the voice that had comforted her as a child. But now it was not comforting. It was pleading. It was desperate. Grandma. Emma whispered into the dark, her voice shaking with uncertainty. The voice in the wall grew louder, more urgent. Emma felt her skin crawl as the whispering intensified. She could almost hear the words now, but they were jumbled, incomprehensible. It was like someone was trying to speak through a thick veil, struggling to reach her. Jack sat up beside her, alarmed. Emma, what's going on? What's happening? But Emma didn't hear him. She was fixated on the sound, on the voice that was calling to her from the walls. Her heart hammered in her chest as she leaned closer to the wall, straining to hear the words, to understand the message. She pressed her ear against the cool surface, her breath shallow. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. Emma sat back in bed, her mind spinning. Jack, did you hear that? She whispered. Jack nodded slowly, his face pale. I heard it. What is it? I don't know, Emma replied, her voice trembling. But I think it's coming from the walls. They spent the rest of the night wide awake, unable to shake the feeling that the house was alive with some presence, something that neither of them could fully comprehend. Emma couldn't help but feel that the house was trying to tell her something important. But what? What? The next day, Emma decided to investigate. She couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. Something was happening, something she couldn't explain, and she needed to find out what. The walls of the house held the answers, she was sure of it. She spent hours that afternoon walking through the house, listening, pressing her ear against every wall, trying to make sense of the sounds. The whispers would come and go, faint at times, but always there just beneath the surface. As she moved from room to room, the whispers became more distinct, and with them came a sense of growing dread. Something was wrong in this house, and Emma knew she couldn't ignore it. She had to know what it wanted, what it needed. And slowly, over time, the walls began to speak more clearly. The fifth story is the dollmaker's curse. Ellie and David had spent weeks scouring the countryside for their perfect home. They had longed for a place away from the fast-paced life of the city, a house surrounded by nature where they could escape the noise and the endless demands of modern life. Grendale, a small town nestled between sprawling forests, seemed like the perfect choice. The town was quiet, the air crisp and fresh, the perfect antidote to the city's clamor. They found a house on the outskirts, an old cottage that had been abandoned for decades. It was everything they had imagined charming, with ivy crawling up the stone walls, a sloping roof, and large windows that overlooked a wild garden. The house had a story, a history that had faded with time. People in the town whispered it, though no one spoke too loudly about the strange occurrences that had once plagued the place. Still, Ellie and David didn't care about the rumors. They were in love with the house. They saw its potential, the possibilities it held. The first few weeks were blissful. They spent their days unpacking and settling in, exploring the overgrown garden, and rediscovering the peaceful rhythms of rural life. They would walk hand in hand through the woods behind the house, breathing in the scent of pine and earth, feeling the weight of their old life slip away. But the house was old, and like most old houses, it creaked and groaned at night. The wind whispered through the rafters, and the floorboards would shift with a soft, unsettling sound. At first, Ellie had taken it in stride. After all, old houses made noises, they were full of character. But the longer they stayed, the more uneasy she began to feel. It was a sensation she couldn't quite place, a feeling that something was watching her. She would find objects slightly out of place, doors left ajar when she was sure she had closed them, the air growing unnaturally cold at times. She told herself it was the house settling, that it was simply the unfamiliar creaks and moans of an old building trying to adjust to its new inhabitants. The attic was the first place Ellie had ventured to when they moved in. She had always been drawn to attics in old houses. There was something magical, something hidden about them. When she ascended the narrow staircase, she wasn't disappointed. The attic was vast, though filled with dust and cobwebs. Old furniture was covered in faded sheets, boxes stacked in corners, forgotten relics of lives lived long ago. It was the perfect space for her to start sorting through old things and finding treasures from the past. Among the boxes of forgotten clothes and old books, Ellie found something strange. Tucked away in a dusty chest, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a collection of porcelain dolls. She had seen dolls like these before, old-fashioned, delicate, their faces frozen in a permanent expression of joy or sorrow, depending on the design. But there was something about these particular dolls that unsettled her. They were arranged neatly in the chest, their eyes wide open, their expressions serene, but somehow lifeless, as though they were staring into her soul. There were dozens of them, each one carefully crafted, each one unique in its features, though all had the same unnerving stillness. Ellie's fingers trembled as she carefully lifted them from the chest, inspecting their fine clothing, the delicate features on their faces. It was clear that whoever had made these dolls had been an artist, someone with an obsessive attention to detail. But the more she examined them, the more uncomfortable she became. They were too perfect, too immaculate, and yet they seemed wrong. There was one doll in particular that caught her eye. It was a girl with long dark hair, her face cracked and discolored with age. But her eyes, those eyes seemed to follow Ellie wherever she went. The other dolls were lifeless, their eyes empty, but this one had a soul. Ellie could almost feel it watching her. She carefully placed the doll back in the chest and sat back, her heart racing. "David," she called, her voice a little more tense than she intended. "You have to see this." David had been downstairs, unpacking the kitchen. When he entered the attic, he saw Ellie standing there, staring at the chest. "What is it?" he asked, walking over to her. Ellie hesitated, unsure how to explain what she had felt. "I found these dolls," she said slowly. "There's something about them. They don't feel right." David looked at the dolls, his brow furrowing. "They're just dolls, Ellie. They're old, sure, but that doesn't mean they're dangerous." Ellie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I don't know," she whispered. "There's just something. I can't explain it. It's like they're watching me." David chuckled softly, trying to reassure her. "You're probably just spooked because the house is so old. Let's leave them up here out of sight. We'll focus on the rest of the house." But Ellie couldn't forget the feeling the dolls had given her. The way they had seemed so lifelike, so intent on following her every movement. The way their eyes had never left her, no matter where she went in the attic. She couldn't shake the thought that they were alive in some way, that they weren't just innocent toys. That night, she placed the dolls in a box and shoved them to the back of the attic, hoping that she could forget about them. But it was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Small things at first. Ellie would hear soft footsteps in the house when no one else was home, the distinct sound of heels clicking on the wooden floor. She would wake up to find the dolls had moved slightly, as if someone had touched them while she slept. But when she confronted David about it, he dismissed it. He told her it was nothing more than the house settling, that she was just letting her imagination run wild. But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And it wasn't just the dolls. There were whispers, faint voices in the night, soft and unintelligible. At first she thought it was the wind, the creaking of the old house, but as the weeks wore on, the whispers grew louder. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. It was as though someone or something was calling to her. One evening, as she sat in the living room reading a book, she heard the whispering again. This time it was louder, more distinct. It was coming from the direction of the attic. Ellie's blood ran cold as the whispers grew clearer. They were saying her name. Softly but clearly, "Ellie, Ellie, but help us." Terrified, Ellie stood up, her heart racing. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to find out what was going on. She couldn't explain the whispers, the feeling of being watched, the way the house seemed to be alive. She grabbed a flashlight and headed up to the attic. As she reached the top of the stairs, the whispering stopped. The house was silent once again. The attic was empty, the dolls still stacked in the corner, their glassy eyes staring out from their box. Ellie moved toward them, her hands trembling as she reached for the top doll. The moment her fingers brushed its cold porcelain surface, the whispers returned, louder this time, more frantic. "Help us, please help us." A shiver ran down her spine as she felt a cold breeze pass through the room. She turned around quickly, scanning the attic for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only the dolls staring at her with their lifeless eyes. It was then that she noticed something strange. The doll she had placed back in the chest, the one with the cracked face and lifeless eyes, was gone. She searched the attic frantically, her pulse quickening, but there was no sign of the doll. It had vanished. As the whispers grew louder, Ellie felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the air grew colder, and the whispers turned to screams. "Help us, help us." Suddenly, the door to the attic slammed shut, trapping her inside. The dolls were no longer motionless, they were moving, their porcelain faces contorting into twisted, horrifying smiles. They began to march toward her. their eyes now alive with an unnatural energy. Ellie backed away, her heart racing in her chest as she stumbled over boxes, desperately trying to escape. But the attic was alive with the sound of clicking porcelain, the dolls closing in around her, their eyes gleaming with malice. She turned to run, but the door wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, shouting for help, but the whispers were deafening now, drowning out her voice. She was trapped, surrounded by the dolls, each one closer than the last, their movements jerky and unnatural. They had been waiting for her, watching her, and now they would claim her as their own. Ellie realized with horror that the dolls weren't just creations. They were alive, and they had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The dollmaker's curse had been passed down through generations, and now it was hers to endure. The dolls weren't just toys, they were vessels for something darker, something that would never let her go. With a final scream, Ellie fell to the floor as the dolls closed in, their cold hands reaching for her. And in that moment she understood the truth. The dollmaker's curse was real, and it would never be broken. The sixth story is the vanishing village. Hannah had always been captivated by stories of forgotten places, towns lost to time, cities swallowed by nature, and villages that vanished without a trace. It wasn't just the mystery of it all that intrigued her, but the deep, unshakable sense of dread that seemed to linger in the air whenever these stories were told. They were like whispers of the past, fragile memories left behind by those who had long since disappeared. One afternoon, as Hannah scrolled through old family documents in the attic of her grandmother's house, she stumbled upon something she hadn't expected to find. A letter, yellowed with age and brittle at the edges. The letter was from her great-grandfather, a man she had never met, and it detailed the story of a village, Dunsmore, one that had disappeared mysteriously. The letter was filled with cryptic references to a place that no one seemed to remember. Her great-grandfather had written that the village was located deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, and that it had been abandoned overnight, as if its entire population had vanished into thin air. The letter was a chilling account of the last time anyone had seen the people of Dunsmore. Her great-grandfather spoke of strange occurrences, the flickering of lights in the distance, odd noises in the woods, and the sudden, unexplained disappearance of the villagers. He had searched for the village, hoping to uncover the truth, but he had found nothing. Only empty, overgrown streets, and homes that seemed frozen in time, as if the village itself had been erased from existence. Hannah was immediately hooked. She had always believed that there was more to these old stories than just superstition or folklore. There had to be a reason for the village's disappearance, something real, something tangible. She felt an inexplicable pull to find Dunsmore, to solve the mystery once and for all. With her great-grandfather's letter in hand, she set out for the woods, determined to uncover the secrets of the vanished village. She drove for hours, the road growing narrower and the trees thicker as she ventured deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, the sun fading behind a veil of clouds, and the atmosphere seemed to change, as though the very earth held its breath. Hannah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she crossed into a part of the forest that felt unfamiliar, unsettling. The road twisted and turned, the path barely visible beneath the layers of fallen leaves and tangled roots. She had no idea where the village would be, but she knew she had to keep going. Eventually, she parked her car near the edge of the woods, her heart pounding with anticipation. The village wasn't on any map, and no one in the nearby town seemed to remember it, though they all spoke in hushed tones whenever she asked about Dunsmore. It was as if the village had never existed, or if it had been erased from memory for some unknown reason. But Hannah couldn't accept that. She needed to see it for herself. The forest swallowed her whole as she walked deeper into the trees. The air grew heavy, thick with a strange, unnatural stillness. The birds had stopped singing, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. She followed the faint remnants of a trail, each step taking her further away from civilization, deeper into the unknown. The trees seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing longer, darker, until it felt as though the forest itself were watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She had been walking for what seemed like hours when she finally saw it through the trees, barely visible through the fog that had begun to roll in. She saw the outline of buildings. The village was real. Dunsmore was right in front of her, hidden away in the heart of the forest, just as her great-grandfather had described it, but something was wrong. The village was frozen in time, but not in the way she had expected. The houses, though clearly old and weathered, were intact, standing as if they had been abandoned only yesterday. The streets were quiet, the air thick with an eerie calm, but there was no sign of life, no people, no animals. The windows of the houses were dark and the doors hung open, as if waiting for someone to enter. The entire village seemed to be in a state of suspended animation, as though the world had simply stopped moving. Hannah stepped cautiously into the village, her breath catching in her throat. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft crunch of her footsteps on the dirt road. The houses were strange, different from anything she had seen before. Some were small cottages, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight of time. Others were larger, more elaborate homes, their stone walls crumbling, yet still standing strong. But it was the lack of life that unsettled her the most. There were no sounds of children playing, no distant chatter from homes, no life at all. It was as though the village had been abandoned in an instant, leaving nothing behind but the buildings themselves. As she wandered further into the village, she began to notice the oddities. The streets were lined with old street lamps, their glass panes cracked but still intact. But the lamps didn't work. There were no lights anywhere in the village, even though the day was drawing to a close and the shadows were lengthening. The houses seemed to have been left in a hurry, as though the inhabitants had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. But there was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anyone had left under duress. It was as if the entire village had just disappeared. Hannah's curiosity pushed her forward, but her unease grew with every step. She had read about ghost towns, places where time stood still, but this felt different. This felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with something that seemed to seep into her skin, into her bones. She could feel eyes watching her, but when she turned to look, there was no one there. She eventually came across the town square, where a large fountain stood at its center. The fountain was dry, the stone cracked and chipped, but the water had been gone for a long time. Around the fountain were several benches, each one strangely positioned as if waiting for someone to sit. But no one was there. The village was still, too still, like a painting frozen in time. It was then that Hannah noticed something else. On the ground, scattered among the fallen leaves and dirt, were strange markings. Symbols, faded and half erased by time, carved into the stone earth. They were not words, but shapes, intricate and strange, like a language she had never seen before. She knelt down, tracing one of the symbols with her fingers. It felt cold, as if the stone itself was alive, pulsing with energy. As her fingers brushed the surface, a sudden chill ran up her spine, and she pulled her hand back, her heart racing. Suddenly, the silence was broken. A sound echoed through the village, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a low, guttural hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around her. The ground trembled slightly, and the trees around her began to sway, their branches creaking as if under some unseen force. Hannah stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, as the hum grew louder, until it became a roar, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The village was silent once more, but this time it was a different silence. It was thick, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Hannah didn't know how long she stood there, but when she finally looked up, she saw them figures moving slowly through the village, their forms blurry, indistinct. At first she thought they were shadows, but as they drew closer she realized they were people, or what had once been people. The villagers, or what remained of them, were walking through the streets in a trance-like state. Their eyes were empty, their faces pale and lifeless, as if they had been drained of all emotion. They moved without purpose, without awareness, as though they were caught in some kind of loop, repeating the same motion over and over. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that the village wasn't empty after all. The people hadn't left. They were still here, trapped in the place they had once called home. But they weren't the same. They were changed. The figures didn't notice her as she backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to get out. Whatever had happened to Dunsmore, to the people who had lived here, it was something far worse than she had imagined. The village had not vanished. It had been cursed, trapped beneath the current of living broken. The hum began again, louder this time, vibrating into her bones as she turned around. The figures followed her, moving slowly at first, but gaining speed as they pursued her through the streets. The village itself seemed to close in around her. The houses warping and shifted, as if the town itself was alive, feeding on her fear. She could hear their footsteps behind her, soft at first, but growing louder as the figures closed in. With every step, Hannah slid in. She couldn't escape them. She couldn't get away from the village, and the people were in the one under her safety. She was caught in its web. She knew it was only a matter of time before the village turned her. This is just the beginning of the expansion of the vanishing village. She's right. I can continue to flesh out the rest of the episode. Let me know if you like